The foreman didn't even look up from his coffee when he said it. "Who fixed your wagon, ma'am?" Dale Grissom called across the yard, loud enough for every ranch hand leaning against the fence to hear. He had that smile, the one men wore when they wanted you to know they weren't impressed. "Surely not you." Evelyn Mercer stood 12 feet away, covered in road mud up to her elbows. Her 6-year-old daughter Lucy pressed against her leg. She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because Lucy did. The little girl lifted one small finger, steady as a compass needle, and pointed directly at her mother. The yard went quiet. Grissom's smile cracked at the edge, and Evelyn Mercer, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 days, who hadn't cried since the funeral, who hadn't asked a single soul for a single thing since her husband went into the ground, felt something shift in her chest that she didn't yet have a name for. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning it happened, Evelyn had already been awake for 2 hours before the sun bothered to show up. That was the rhythm of it now. Her body had forgotten how to sleep past 4, as if rest itself had packed its things and left the same week Thomas did. She'd lie in the dark, listening to the old house settle and creak around her, listening to Lucy breathe through the thin wall between their rooms, listening to a silence that should have felt peaceful, but never quite did. She'd get up, she'd stoke the fire. She'd make coffee so strong it could have stripped paint off a wagon wheel, and she'd stand at the kitchen window watching the first gray light touch the fence posts along the east pasture. Then she'd go to work. It was October, which meant the mud season had arrived early and without apology. The road that cut from her property down to Harlan Creek and eventually into the town of Caldwell Flats turned mean in October. Rutted deep from summer wagon traffic, softened by 2 weeks of steady rain until it had the consistency of wet clay and the temperament of something that wanted to swallow you whole. She knew better than to take the wagon on it. Thomas had always said October roads would humble you if you let your guard down. But Thomas wasn't here to be right about anything anymore, and Lucy had a cough that had been sitting in her chest for 6 days, and the Mercantile in Caldwell Flats was the only place within 20 miles that carried the camphor oil that helped. So she hitched old Bram to the wagon at 7:30, loaded Lucy up under 2 blankets on the bench seat, and told herself the road couldn't be that bad. The road was that bad. They made it 4 miles before the front left wheel dropped into a rut that Evelyn hadn't seen coming. Couldn't have seen it. The mud had filled it flush with the surface, a perfect trap. And the wagon lurched hard to the left and settled in at an angle that told her immediately, with a sick certainty in her stomach, that they weren't going anywhere under their own power. Old Bram leaned into the harness twice. Twice the wheels sucked deeper. "Mama?" Lucy said. "I know. Are we stuck?" "We're working on it." She climbed down into the mud, which came up past her ankles and grabbed at her boots like it had opinions about the matter. She put her shoulder against the wagon bed and pushed while calling to Bram, and the horse strained and the wheel didn't move. She tried 3 more times, each attempt covering more of her in mud, each attempt making her more furious with herself and with the road and with the season and with the general fact of everything. Lucy watched from the bench seat with enormous eyes. She had learned in the years since Thomas died to be very quiet when her mother was problem-solving. Evelyn straightened up. She looked at the road ahead, then behind, then at the tree line on either side. There was no one. There was never anyone on this stretch. It was one of the things she'd liked about this land when they'd first come out here, the privacy of it, the feeling that the world wasn't breathing down your neck. Right now, she would have given considerable money for a stranger to come around that bend. She went back to pushing. She was on her 4th serious attempt, both hands braced against the wagon bed, her breath coming out in white clouds, when she heard hooves. She didn't look up immediately. She kept pushing, because she would be damned if she was going to be caught standing around looking helpless. The hooves slowed to a walk behind her, then stopped. She heard a man clear his throat. "Looks like you could use a hand." "I'm fine," she said. She hadn't looked at him yet. A pause. "Wheels dug in pretty good." "I noticed." Another pause. "I've got to come along in my saddlebag. Take about 10 minutes." Evelyn straightened up and turned around. The man was still on his horse, a gray quarter horse, built solid, with the look of an animal that had seen hard work and didn't complain about it. The man on his back was maybe 40, maybe a little less, with a face that had been weathered the way working faces get, not unpleasant, but lived in, with the particular stillness about him of someone who was comfortable with silence. He wasn't smiling. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. Men usually smiled when they found a woman in trouble, that particular smile that meant they were already composing the story they'd tell later. This man just looked at her wagon with a professional kind of assessment, the way you'd look at a fence that needed mending. "I'll pay you for your time," she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "That's not necessary." "I don't take charity. I wasn't offering any." He swung down from the horse in a single unhurried motion. "Just to come along in 10 minutes. We can call it neighboring." She watched him pull the tool from his saddlebag. He moved with economy. No wasted motion, no performance for her benefit. He crouched down beside the wheel and looked at the angle of the rut, then stood up and looked at the tree line, identifying his anchor point before he said another word. She found herself paying attention to this. Thomas had moved like that. Men who actually knew what they were doing usually did. "If you hold Bram's head," he said, "I'll do the rest." She went to hold Bram's head. It took 11 minutes, not 10. The wheel came up out of the mud with a sound like the earth releasing something it had decided to let go of, and the wagon lurched forward onto solid ground and stopped there, sitting level and cooperative as though it hadn't just spent 20 minutes being an absolute problem. "There," the man said. He was wiping his hands on a cloth from his jacket pocket. He looked at Lucy, who was staring at him from the bench seat with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has no social filters. "You doing all right up there?" "I have a cough," Lucy informed him. "Sorry to hear it. Mama makes me drink honey, and it's disgusting." "Lucy," Evelyn said. "It is, though." The man, she didn't know his name yet, looked like he was considering smiling but was exercising restraint about it. "Camphor oil's better," he said, "if you can get it." "That's where we're going," Evelyn said. She was reattaching Bram's harness, which had gone slack in all the pulling. "Caldwell Flats. Road's better once you get past the Miller Creek crossing. Stays rocky after that. I know the road." "Of course." He folded the cloth, put it back in his pocket. "Silas Boone." He said it simply, not extending a hand because his were still dirty from the wheel work. "I've taken on the foreman position out at the Grissom spread, the Coronado Ranch." Evelyn went still for just a fraction of a second. Then she kept working the harness buckle. Coronado Ranch. She knew that name the way you knew the name of a neighbor you'd never spoken to, but watched carefully. The Grissom operation sat on 800 acres adjacent to her own 140, a sprawling cattle operation that had been buying up smaller properties on either side of Caldwell Flats for the better part of 5 years. Dale Grissom was the third generation of Grissoms to run it, and the first one anyone described as genuinely unpleasant. "I know the Coronado," she said. She climbed back up onto the bench seat. "Evelyn Mercer. The Mercer homestead is 3 miles back east." "I know the Mercer spread." There was something in how he said it that made her look at him directly for the first time since she'd turned around. His expression hadn't changed, still that same level, unhurried look, but she had the distinct impression that there was more behind the sentence than he was offering. She gathered the reins. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "You're welcome, Mrs. Mercer." She clicked her tongue at Bram and they moved off down the road. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on the wagon until they went around the bend, the way you can feel someone watching when they're being honest about it rather than trying to hide it. "I liked him," Lucy announced. "You liked him in the 30 seconds you talked to him about honey. He has a nice horse." "That's a very thorough evaluation." "His eyes are sad," Lucy said, with the complete confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided she is correct. "Like yours were, before they got tired instead." Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. She didn't say anything to that. Lucy's accuracy was sometimes difficult to navigate. Caldwell Flats was one of those frontier towns that had arrived with ambitions and revised them over the years. It had a church, a school that ran 3 days a week, a mercantile, a livery, a blacksmith, a saloon that also functioned as the town's only hotel, and a population of about 230 people who all knew each other's business better than they knew their own. Evelyn had lived adjacent to it for 7 years and had never fully belonged to it. That wasn't bitterness talking. It was just accurate. She and Thomas had come out west with their own ideas, their own rhythms, and the kind of stubborn self-reliance that didn't naturally fold into the conversational architecture of a small town. They'd been polite but private. Thomas had been good at it. Evelyn was adequate. After Thomas died, she'd become less adequate. Grief did things to your social graces. She tied Bram at the post outside the mercantile and lifted Lucy down from the seat, and they went inside. The bell above the door announced them. Margaret Holt, who ran the mercantile with her husband and an opinion about every living person in the county, looked up from behind the counter. Evelyn and little Lucy. Margaret's smile had the particular warmth of a woman who genuinely liked children and genuinely complicated feelings about their mothers. You're covered in mud, Evelyn. October roads. You came down from the homestead on your own? I did. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated volumes. She was already reaching under the counter. Camphor oil? Please. You could send word, you know. Walt makes the supply run every Tuesday. He goes right past your... I prefer to come in myself. Evelyn put coins on the counter. Thank you, Margaret. I heard you were seen on the road this morning. Evelyn counted out the exact change. Were you? Billy Holt? That's my nephew. He runs cattle for the Tanner operation now. He came through just an hour ago. Said he saw Silas Boone helping a woman with a stuck wagon. Evelyn picked up the camphor oil. Roads were muddy. That's the new Coronado Foreman, you know, Boone. He introduced himself. Margaret leaned on the counter. She had the look of someone arranging information into a shape they found significant. Dale Grissom brought him in from out of the panhandle. Nobody knows much about him. He's quiet. She said quiet the way you might say unusual. Keeps to himself. Sensible approach, Evelyn said. She took Lucy's hand. I need to get back before the afternoon mud sets. Evelyn. Margaret's voice shifted, dropping the conversational ease for something more direct. Dale Grissom was in here last week. He was asking about your water rights. Evelyn stopped. She turned around. Margaret was watching her with an expression that had moved past gossip into something that looked almost like concern. He wasn't asking me specifically. He was talking to Harv Patterson about the county records. But I heard him say your name, your property name. The two women looked at each other across the mercantile counter, across the camphor oil and the coins, across 7 years of arm's-length politeness. Thank you, Margaret, Evelyn said. She meant it, and Margaret knew she meant it. And that small specific transaction of genuine gratitude was perhaps the most honest thing they'd exchanged in years. She drove home faster than she should have. The road was better, like Silas Boone had said it would be. Rocky past the creek crossing, more predictable. But her mind was not on the road. Water rights. Dale Grissom asking about her water rights. She knew what that meant. She wasn't a woman who required long explanations. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property was the same water source that Coronado Ranch used for its lower pastures, and it had been a shared arrangement since before Thomas bought the land, a handshake agreement between Thomas and Dale Grissom's father that had never been put in writing because Thomas had trusted older Grissom, because older Grissom had been a man worth trusting. But older Grissom was 6 years in the ground, and Dale Grissom did not share his father's relationship with verbal agreements. If Dale moved on the water rights, if he hired a lawyer and went to the county records and found a way to establish exclusive claim, she could lose the irrigation that kept her east field alive. The east field was her corn and her hay. The hay fed her cattle through winter. Without the hay. She stopped that thought. She'd been stopping thoughts like that for a year. You stopped them because if you followed them to their end, you arrived at a place you couldn't afford to spend time in. Mama, Lucy said. She had the camphor oil in her lap and was reading the label with the careful attention of someone who cannot quite read yet, but is maintaining the appearance. Are we going to be okay? Evelyn looked at her daughter. Lucy was looking back at her with those eyes that saw things, that had always seen things, that would probably continue seeing things in ways that Evelyn found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. Yes, Evelyn said. You're doing the jaw thing. What jaw thing? The thing where your jaw gets tight when you're worried about something but you're not going to say what. Evelyn deliberately relaxed her jaw. We're going to be fine. Okay, Lucy said. She went back to examining the camphor oil label. That man this morning, Mr. Boone, he works for the ranch next to ours, doesn't he? He does. Is that bad? Evelyn looked at the road ahead. The homestead fence line was coming up on the left. She could see the gap in the posts where the third section had given way last month, the one she'd been meaning to repair, the one that had been waiting behind 17 other things on a list that never got shorter. I don't know yet, she said honestly. It was more honest than she usually allowed herself to be with Lucy, who was 6 years old and had already dealt with more truth than most 6-year-olds needed. But there was something about the day, the mud, the wagon, the mercantile conversation, the specific sensation of a name she didn't yet know how to categorize sitting in the back of her mind, that made her feel like pretending she had answers she didn't have would be a particular kind of waste of energy. Lucy nodded as though this was a satisfactory response. He had calluses, she said. I saw when he touched the wheel, like Papa had. Evelyn pulled the wagon through the gate. She didn't answer that either. Some things didn't need answers. Some things just needed to be allowed to sit there, true and uncomfortable, until you figured out what to do with them. She fixed the fence herself that afternoon. It took 3 hours and the use of language she was glad Lucy was inside for, and the post driver raised a blister on her right palm that she was going to be feeling for a week. But she fixed it. When she was done, she stood back and looked at the line of posts, not beautiful but solid, and felt the particular exhausted satisfaction of a thing done by your own hands. The sun was getting low. The light came in at that October angle that turned everything gold and long-shadowed, the kind of light that Thomas had always liked, that he said made the land look like it was being seen at its most honest. She went inside. She made dinner. She rubbed camphor oil on Lucy's chest and listened to the child's breathing until it seemed clearer, and she tucked her in and sat beside the bed in the dark for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went to the kitchen table and opened the tin box where she kept the papers. She went through them slowly, the way she did every few weeks when the anxiety about the property got too loud to ignore. The deed. The water agreement. The one that existed only in a letter from old Grissom to Thomas 7 years ago. 2 paragraphs of careful frontier handwriting that said the water from the creek would be shared as it had always been shared. A letter. Not a contract. Not a legal document. A letter. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up on the ridge. Old Bram shifted in the barn. The house made its usual sounds. The tick and settle of old wood. The wind finding the loose shingle on the northwest corner that she had also been meaning to fix. Silas Boone, new Coronado foreman, came from the panhandle. Quiet. She closed the tin box. She told herself the information was irrelevant. A man who'd helped with a wagon on a muddy road was just that. A man. A morning. A piece of luck that didn't obligate her to anything, and that didn't change anything about her situation, or the situation with the water rights, or the fence, or the roof section over the barn that she could see 3 stars through on a clear night. But Lucy's words were still sitting there in the back of her mind, small and stubborn. He has a nice horse. His eyes are sad. Evelyn went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, and told herself she was not thinking about anything in particular. She was not entirely convincing. So, 3 days later, she was mending harness leather on the front porch when she heard horses on the road. She looked up. 2 of them. And one was the gray quarter horse she recognized without quite meaning to. Silas Boone pulled up at her gate. He wasn't alone. The man behind him was younger, early 20s, with the nervous energy of someone who has been told to keep his mouth shut and is working hard at it. Boone stayed on his horse. He looked at the fence line she'd repaired, then at her, then at the fence line again. That's solid work, he said. She kept mending the harness. It is. The eastern post looks like it might give in another hard rain, though. Angle's off. She looked at him. He looked back at her without apology. I'm not wrong. I know you're not wrong. She set the harness down. What do you want, Mr. Boone? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone arranging a lie. More the quiet of someone deciding how much truth to give and in what order. Dale Grissom asked me this morning to ride out and take a look at your eastern fence line, he said. He's going to claim the creek border is disputed. I think you should know that. The world got very still around her. He sent you to tell me that. No. Boone's voice was level. He sent me to look at the fence line. I'm telling you the rest on my own time. The younger man on the other horse was staring at his saddle horn like it held the answers to large philosophical questions. He clearly hadn't known this was part of the ride. Evelyn looked at Silas Boone for a long moment. Why? She said. He met her eyes. Because it's right to. It was the simplest possible answer. She didn't know what to do with it. Simple answers from men with interests she didn't fully understand were not something her experience had prepared her to trust. But there was something about the directness of him, not charming, not trying to be liked, just straight, that made the usual defenses feel slightly beside the point. You work for Grissom, she said. I'm foreman at the Coronado, he said. That's different than being in his pocket. She picked up the harness again. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. I'll look at the Eastern Post, she said. He nodded once. He turned his horse. Mr. Boone. He stopped. Next time you ride out on Grissom's business, she said, I'd appreciate you stating that up front. Something moved across his face. It might have been respect. It might have been something she didn't have a word for yet. Fair enough, he said. He rode away. The young hand followed him, still staring at his saddle horn, having made the decision that whatever he'd just witnessed was not something he was going to discuss with Dale Grissom. Evelyn sat on the porch with the harness in her lap. The Eastern Post. She'd look at the Eastern Post. And then she was going to find out exactly what Dale Grissom had said to the county record office about the creek. Because quiet men with honest eyes and employment at the neighboring ranch did not ride out to give warnings for no reason. And warnings that came at a cost to the person giving them were the only kind worth taking seriously. She folded the harness. She stood up. There was a lot of work to do. The Eastern Post was worse than Boone had said. Evelyn found that out the morning after his visit, when she went out at first light with a lantern and crouched down in the wet grass to look at it properly. The base had rotted through, not visibly, not from a distance, but at ground level you could see where the wood had gone soft and dark, where the soil had held moisture against it through a wet summer and done its patient work. The fence above looked fine. The foundation was gone. She stood up and looked down the fence line. Then she looked at the creek, maybe 40 yards east, running low and clear the way it did in October before the winter rains came to fill it back up. The creek that Dale Grissom apparently wanted to argue was his. She pulled the post herself that afternoon, dug out the bad soil around the hole, set a new post from the pile Thomas had cut 2 summers ago, and left seasoning in the barn. She tamped it in layers, the way Thomas had shown her, packing the earth every 6 inches instead of all at once, because rushed fences failed in the first hard wind, and that was a lesson you only needed to learn once. When she was done, she was dirty, and her back ached in the specific way of a woman who'd been doing work designed for 2 people and doing it alone. And the post was plumb and solid, and she stood there looking at it in the fading light and felt the particular hollow satisfaction of a thing done correctly when there was no one around to notice. She didn't ask for help. That wasn't stubbornness exactly. Or maybe it was, a little. But it was also something she couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through what she'd lived through. The particular terror of needing people, of letting yourself depend on a structure that could simply stop existing one morning without warning. Thomas hadn't meant to die. He hadn't chosen to leave her with 140 acres and a 5-year-old and a list of repairs that multiplied faster than she could address it. He'd just been gone, and she'd had to figure out how to exist inside that fact. And what she'd figured out was that you put your weight on yourself because yourself was the only thing you could be certain wouldn't disappear. It was a philosophy with costs. She knew that. She wasn't blind to the toll of it, but it had kept her standing. November arrived the way November always did on the frontier, so not gradually, not politely, but as a blunt announcement that the season's tolerance had ended. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The mud froze overnight and thawed badly by noon, creating a surface that was neither solid nor liquid and hostile to everything that tried to cross it. The creek went up 6 inches from early rains, and the lower pasture flooded along the southern edge. The barn roof, which Evelyn had been monitoring with the resigned attention of someone watching a slow disaster develop, chose the first week of November to worsen. The loose section on the northwest corner wasn't just loose anymore. 3 shingles had gone in a wind she hadn't even noticed as particularly violent, and now there was a gap the size of her forearm that let in rain and cold air, and on one memorable morning, a small confused sparrow. She put a bucket under it. She climbed up to look at it and understood immediately that this was beyond a ladder and hammer repair. The underlying board had warped. Half that section of roofing needed to come off and go back on right, and she did not have the materials, and she was not sure she had the skill, and she was not sure she could do it safely alone at the height the barn roof required. She put another bucket next to the first one and went back to her list. There was also the irrigation situation. The channel Thomas had dug 5 years ago to bring water from the creek across the upper field had silted badly over summer, and without clearing it before the ground froze solid, she'd lose the ability to irrigate the east field come spring. She'd been meaning to get to it in September. Then October had happened, and September's list had rolled into October's list. And now it was November, and the ground was starting to freeze at night, and she was running out of time. She started on the irrigation channel one morning when Lucy was at school. The Caldwell Flats schoolhouse ran 4 days a week now, Miss Delaney having successfully argued for the extra day. And she worked until noon when her hand stopped cooperating, and she'd cleared maybe a third of what needed clearing. She stood in the field with mud on her arms to the elbows, looking at the remaining 2/3, doing the arithmetic in her head that she'd been refusing to do for 2 weeks. Time, materials, physical capacity. The days until the ground would be too hard to work. None of the numbers were friendly. She heard someone approaching along the fence line and looked up. Silas Boone. On foot this time, which surprised her. He was carrying something, a box of some kind. Wooden, maybe tool-related. He stopped at the fence and looked at the channel she'd been digging, then at her, then at the channel again with that same professional assessment she'd noticed the first time. "I've got a draw hoe that'll go faster," he said. She looked at him. "Where's your horse?" "Left him at the road. Didn't want to assume I was welcome to bring him in." That stopped her for a second. It was such a specific courtesy. The kind that came from actually thinking about the other person, not from following a social script. "What's in the box?" she said. He held it up slightly. "Shingles. I had a surplus from re-roofing the Coronado equipment shed last month. Saw the gap on your barn when I rode past." She looked at the box of shingles. She looked at him. "You rode past?" "I go past on the way to the Miller pasture. South Road." The South Road did go past the edge of her property. That was true. "I'm not taking charity, Mr. Boone. They're surplus shingles. They're either going on your barn or they're sitting in a stack getting warped." He shrugged. "Your call." She pulled her hat off, wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, and put it back on. She thought about the bucket. She thought about the ground that was going to freeze in approximately 3 weeks. She thought about the arithmetic she'd been refusing to do and what it said. "The draw hoe," she said. "Where is it?" "I can have it here tomorrow morning." "Bring it then." He nodded. He didn't look satisfied about it, didn't look like he'd won something. He just nodded the way you'd nod when a plan has been made and there's work to be done and there's no particular reason to make more of it than that. He was almost back to the fence when she said, "The roof is worse than the shingles." He stopped. He turned back. "The board underneath, the one that warped. I don't have replacement material." Boone looked at the barn. The gap was visible from the field, dark against the weathered roof. "What kind?" 2x10 pine, probably 8-foot run. I'll look in the Coronado lumber store. I'll pay for it. We'll figure out a fair exchange." He said it simply, not as a negotiation, just as a statement that the details could be worked out without drama. "Is there anything else that's pressing?" She almost said no. She was most of the way to no before she stopped herself because the arithmetic was still there, the numbers still unfriendly, and no was her reflex rather than her considered position. "The south fence needs 2 new posts before December," she said, "and the irrigation needs 2 more days of work at minimum." He absorbed this without expression. "I can spare time on Tuesday and Friday mornings if Grissom doesn't need me on the range." "Does Grissom know you're here?" A pause. I don't report my movements during my personal time. That's not an answer. He met her eyes. No. Grissom doesn't know I'm here. She held his gaze. The wind came down off the ridge and moved the dry grass along the fence line and made the gap in the barn roof creak once. If this causes you trouble at the Coronado, she started. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. His voice was patient, not dismissive. Mrs. Mercer, I'm not a man who does things sideways. If I thought helping you repair your property was going to compromise my position in a way I couldn't manage, I wouldn't have offered. I have my own reasons for being careful about what I step into. She wanted to ask what that meant. She didn't. Tuesday, then, she said. If you can. I can. He left. She went back to the channel and worked until the light failed, and when she went inside, she was so tired she barely got Lucy's dinner together before her own hands went unreliable, and she sat at the kitchen table afterward and stared at the grain of the wood and tried to figure out what she felt about the afternoon's arrangement. What she felt mostly was frightened, not of Boone, of the wanting, of the specific danger of starting to count on something, someone, and how quietly and completely that could undo you. You're doing the jaw thing again, Lucy said from across the table. Evelyn consciously relaxed her jaw. Finish your beans. He came Tuesday. He came with the draw hoe and a younger hand named Pete, who didn't say much but worked without being directed and didn't look at Evelyn like she was a problem to be managed. In 3 hours, they cleared the rest of the irrigation channel. Evelyn worked alongside them. She'd been clear about that. She wasn't going to stand on her own property and watch other people do work while she directed. And at one point, she and Boone were at the same section of channel from opposite sides, and she had to admit, privately, that the work went differently with another set of hands that knew what they were doing. Not easier, exactly. Different. There was a rhythm to shared work that solo work didn't have. She hadn't felt that rhythm in a long time. Pete went back to the Coronado after the channel was done. Boone stayed. He went up on the barn roof while Evelyn worked on the south fence posts, and she could hear him up there. Careful movement, no rushing, the measured sound of someone who respected heights without being afraid of them. She didn't watch. She worked. When he came down, he found her on the third fence post, tamping soil. Board was worse than just the one section, he said. I used the full 8 feet of pine and then some. You've got a 3-foot section on the east side of that run that needs watching. I'll watch it. I can come back with more lumber in 2 weeks. How much do I owe you for the pine? He told her. It was fair. Actually fair. Not fair, but less than she expected. It was what pine cost, which she knew because she'd checked at the Caldwell Flats hardware 2 weeks back. I'll have it for you Friday, she said. He nodded. He looked at the fence post she was packing. He didn't offer to take over. He just watched for a moment with that level attention, and she thought again about what Lucy had said. He has a nice horse, his eyes are sad, and wondered what had put that sadness there. What history was behind the surface of this man who did things carefully and straight and didn't seem to want anything obvious from her? Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. She kept packing the post. Grissom, what's he after with the water rights? The pause was brief. The direct version or the careful one? I don't have time for careful. He wants your land, Boone said. The water rights are the mechanism. If he can establish that the creek belongs to the Coronado, he can argue your East Field irrigation is trespassing on his water, which gives him grounds for a legal dispute, which costs you money you don't have and time you can't spare, which maybe eventually makes you sell. She stopped tamping. She stood up and looked at him. He told you this? He didn't have to. Boone's voice was level. I've worked ranching operations for 20 years. I know what land acquisition looks like at the early stages. Grissom's been buying up small properties on the south side of Caldwell Flats for 3 years. Yours is the last holdout on the east side. Why are you telling me? It was the same question she'd asked before. She asked it again because the first answer, because it's right to, hadn't been enough. It was the kind of answer that could mean many things. Boone looked at her for a moment, not measuring her up, not performing honesty, just looking, the way you looked at something when you were deciding whether to say the true thing or a version of it. I took the Coronado job because I needed work, he said. I didn't take it because I agree with how Grissom operates. Those are different things, and I've been clear with myself about where the line is. He paused. Helping him take a widow's property by squeezing her water rights is on the wrong side of that line. She held his gaze. The wind was picking up from the north. That's going to cause you trouble, she said. Maybe. He looked at the fence post. Is that one plumb? She looked down. It is. Good. He picked up his tools. I'll be here Friday if Grissom doesn't pull me for something. If he does, I'll send word with Pete. She watched him walk back toward the road where he'd left his horse. Mr. Boone. He turned around. Thank you, she said. She meant it the way she'd meant it with Margaret in the Mercantile. Not as a social grace, but as an actual specific thing. For the straight version. He nodded once. He left. She went back to her post. The soil was cold and packed reluctantly, and she had 2 more to do before the light went. She worked steadily and didn't let herself think about anything except the angle of the post and the feel of the earth and the particular satisfaction of a line of fence that was going to hold. The problem with small towns was that they watched. She'd known this for 7 years and had mostly made her peace with it, the way you made peace with weather. You couldn't change it. You could only decide how much to let it get under your skin. But the watching intensified in November, because November on the frontier meant that the primary outdoor work was done and people had more time indoors to talk about each other. Margaret Holt told her on a Thursday supply run that people were talking, not unkindly, or not all of it unkindly, but talking. A man from the Coronado spending time on the Mercer homestead, 2 different Tuesdays now, and a Friday, and someone had seen Pete Delaney's horse tied at her fence one morning. What exactly was the arrangement? Was it a business thing or a personal thing? And if it was a business thing, what kind of business did a widowed homesteader have with a Coronado foreman, given that the Coronado and the Mercer property weren't exactly natural allies? People are curious, Margaret said, with the careful neutrality of someone who was herself curious. People can stay that way, Evelyn said. Evelyn. Margaret put her hands on the counter. I'm not judging. I want to be clear about that. But there are some who are, and some of them have got opinions about what you should be doing with your property that they're not shy about. Such as, Margaret hesitated. Pastor Whelan mentioned at the Ladies' Aid last week that a widowed woman of independent means might consider whether she was best suited to managing a homestead alone. He put it gently. I'm sure he did. And the Denton brothers, the ones who bought the Harley property last spring, they came into the Mercantile asking about your acreage. Evelyn went still. The Denton brothers work for Grissom, she said. They do? There it was. Grissom had felt out the water rights. Now he was feeling out the acreage itself, through intermediaries, through inquiries that could be waved away as casual interest, building a record of market interest, making it look like more than one party wanted to buy, which would pressure the price downward and make it look like the reasonable thing to do was sell. She knew this pattern. She hadn't seen it up close before, but she recognized it the way you recognize the shape of a storm from a distance. If anyone else comes asking, Evelyn said, the Mercer homestead is not for sale. Margaret looked at her. Grissom has a lawyer coming in from Amarillo, I heard. Good for him. Evelyn, I know what you're trying to do. She picked up her supplies. And I appreciate it, truly. But I've got 140 acres with my husband's name on the deed and my daughter's future in the soil, and I am not in a mood to be strategized out of it by Dale Grissom or his Amarillo lawyer or anyone else. She went to the door. The draw hoe, she said, half to herself. She'd left Boone's draw hoe at the homestead after Tuesday. She needed to get it back to him. She did not want to examine why she'd left it there instead of sending it back with Pete. She ran into Boone at the Caldwell Flats blacksmith on Friday afternoon, which was not planned. She'd brought a broken trace chain in for repair. He was there about a Coronado saddle fitting. They nearly walked into each other coming around opposite sides of the anvil stand, and both stepped back, and there was a moment that was briefly awkward in the specific way of 2 people who have been spending time together but haven't decided what to call it. Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Boone. Pete Delaney, who was with Boone, looked at his boots with the expression of someone doing a heroic job of not existing. I have your draw hoe, she said. I should have sent it back. No hurry on it. I'll bring it to the Coronado Gate Monday. Something moved across his face. Brief, almost imperceptible. I can get it when I come out Tuesday. You're coming Tuesday? If you still need those south fence posts finished, I can do those myself. I know you can. He held her eyes. I'll bring the draw hoe back myself. That way it gets done. She heard the specific firmness of that. Not controlling, not overriding her. Just the simple insistence of someone who intended to continue doing what he'd been doing and wasn't making a complicated thing of it. Tuesday, then, she said. He nodded. He went back to talking to the blacksmith about the saddle fitting. She waited for her trace chain. Pete Delaney continued to study the floor with tremendous concentration. She got home at dusk. Lucy was at the kitchen table drawing something with a piece of charcoal on brown paper. She'd been going through a phase of drawings in which everything had very large eyes, people, horses, chickens, all with enormous serious eyes looking out from the paper. Mr. Boone is coming Tuesday, Lucy said, without looking up. Evelyn hung up her coat. He is. Is he bringing Pete? I don't know. I like Pete. He taught me what the knots on a saddle are called last time. She pressed her charcoal harder, adding detail to something that appeared to be a horse. Is Mr. Boone going to come every Tuesday and Friday? For now, while there's work to be done. There's always work to be done, Lucy said, with the pragmatic accuracy of a child who had been watching her mother manage a homestead for a year and had drawn reasonable conclusions. Evelyn sat down across from her daughter. Lucy was drawing with her tongue between her teeth, entirely absorbed. The horse on the paper had enormous eyes. It looked, Evelyn thought, a little like Boone's gray quarter horse. She didn't say this. Are you okay? She asked instead. Lucy looked up. Me? You. Are you doing all right? Lucy considered this with the seriousness it seemed to deserve. My cough is gone. Good. I miss Papa. I know, I do too. But it's not as loud as it was, Lucy said. The missing. It used to be very loud, and now it's more like... She scrunched up her face, searching for it. Like when you can hear rain coming, but it's not here yet. You know it's there, but you're not soaking wet. Evelyn looked at her daughter. Sometimes Lucy put language to things that Evelyn had been feeling but couldn't name, and it was startling every time, that precision in a 6-year-old. That's a good way to put it, she said. Lucy went back to her drawing. I think Mr. Boone's missing is still very loud, she said conversationally. I think something happened to him. What makes you say that? He's very careful, Lucy said, like he's afraid of breaking something. But there's nothing to break. We're not fragile. She added an eye to the horse, decided it was the wrong size, and tried again. I think someone told him once that he broke something, and he believed it. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the early dark of November had settled over everything, and the wind was moving through the dried grass along the fence line, and the barn roof, repaired now, solid, didn't creak anymore. Evelyn watched her daughter draw. Whatever Silas Boone's history was, she didn't know it. She'd made a point of not asking. But Lucy's observations had a way of landing, and Evelyn sat with this one, very careful, like he's afraid of breaking something, and thought about what that meant, coming from a man who did everything with that particular unhurried deliberateness, who left his horse at the road rather than assume, who gave the straight version when asked and didn't seem to want anything back for it. She was careful, too. For different reasons, maybe. Or maybe the same reasons arrived at from different directions. She didn't know what to do with that. She got up and started making supper because supper needed making, and thinking too long about things you couldn't act on yet was a waste of fuel she didn't have to spare. The whispers hit a different register the second week of November, when Dorothy Vance, who sat on the Caldwell Flats Women's Council with Margaret and 3 others, and had opinions about the organization of Frontier Society that she expressed frequently and without invitation, stopped Evelyn after the school pickup on a Thursday. Dorothy was not unkind. She was something almost harder to deal with, which was well-intentioned and wrong. Evelyn, dear, she said, and the deer set Evelyn's jaw before anything else had been said. I wonder if you've thought about the way things look. Good afternoon, Dorothy. With the Coronado Foreman coming to your property. Dorothy kept her voice low and her face pleasantly arranged. I know there's work to be done, and goodness knows you've managed admirably on your own. But people talk, and a woman in your position— What position is that? Dorothy blinked. A widow, on her own, with a young child. Those are facts about my life, Dorothy. They're not a position that requires managing. I only mean that people wonder what the arrangement is. Then people can mind their wondering. Lucy was pressed against Evelyn's leg, looking up at Dorothy with those large, careful eyes that saw everything. Evelyn put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. If anyone asks you directly what the arrangement is, you can tell them. A neighbor is helping with fence repairs and roof work in exchange for fair payment. That's the entirety of it. Dorothy's expression suggested she felt the entirety of it was the problem. Dale Grissom has said, I'm not interested in what Dale Grissom has said. He's saying it around town, Evelyn. He's saying that the foreman has taken an inappropriate personal interest in the Mercer homestead, and that it reflects poorly on the Coronados. Dale Grissom, Evelyn said, carefully and very clearly, is trying to buy my property through legal pressure and public narrative, and I'd appreciate if you'd think about that before you repeat his framing to me as though it were concern. Dorothy opened her mouth, closed it. Good afternoon, Evelyn said. She walked Lucy to the wagon. She lifted Lucy up onto the bench seat and climbed up herself and gathered the reins, and her hands were entirely steady, and she was extremely angry, and she drove home without saying a word for the first mile. You were right, Lucy said eventually. I know. Mrs. Vance looks like she smelled something bad when you said that. Lucy. She did. Evelyn almost smiled, stopped herself. Don't be unkind about people. Even when they're being unkind about you? Especially then. She looked at her daughter. It costs more to be petty than to be decent. Most people don't realize that until it's too late. Lucy absorbed this. Is Mr. Grissom petty? Mr. Grissom is something more deliberate than petty. Is he dangerous? The question sat between them. Lucy had asked it without drama, in the same tone she used to ask about the weather or the state of the irrigation channel. A practical question requiring an honest answer. He's working to take something from us, Evelyn said. That makes him something we need to take seriously. Lucy nodded. We should tell Mr. Boone. Mr. Boone already knows more of it than we do. Then we should work faster. Lucy turned forward and watched the road with an expression of practical determination that was so much like Thomas it made Evelyn's chest tighten. Winter's coming. We need everything solid before it gets here. She was 6 years old, and she was right. Evelyn pushed the horse to a faster walk, and the late November light fell gray and flat across the road. And somewhere up behind them, at the Coronado Ranch, Dale Grissom's Amarillo lawyer had arrived 2 days ago and was sitting in the office going through county records. And the winter was coming in fast, and there was everything still to do. The lawyer's name was Hargrove, and he arrived at the Mercer homestead on a Tuesday morning without sending word ahead. Evelyn was in the barn when she heard the buggy, doing the kind of unglamorous work that barns required in November, mucking, checking feed levels, making sure the water trough hadn't frozen overnight at the edges. She came out with a pitchfork in her hand and straw in her hair and met the man standing at her gate in a suit that had no business being within 50 miles of a working frontier property. He was maybe 50, trim, with the practice-neutral expression of a man who spent his professional life delivering news that other people didn't want to hear. He held a leather satchel in one hand and had a hat in the other that he hadn't put on yet, which she took as either courtesy or calculation. Mrs. Mercer, he said, my name is Gerald Hargrove. I represent the Consolidated Western Land Syndicate. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. She kept the pitchfork in her hand, not threateningly. She just didn't put it down. Who sent you? The syndicate is an independent entity, Mrs. Mercer. We represent a number of investment interests in frontier land development, and who sent you to my gate specifically? A brief pause. He was good. She could see he was good. The pause was almost imperceptible, but it was there. We became aware of your property through our regional survey. Your acreage is well positioned, and we believe, Mr. Hargrove, she kept her voice even. I know who you're working through, and I know why you're here. If you have an offer, say the number. Don't waste my morning with the introduction. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Respect, maybe, or the recalibration a man makes when the person across from him isn't who he expected. He opened his satchel and produced a single folded paper. The number on it was not insulting. That was the most alarming thing about it. It was real money. More than fair market value for 140 acres of frontier property in October, more than what the Denton brothers' inquiry had suggested. Enough to buy a house in Caldwell Flats with a proper roof and a yard, and no irrigation channels to clear before the ground froze. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to understand it. Then she folded it back up. No, she said. Hargrove blinked. Mrs. Mercer, I'd encourage you to… The answer is no. She handed the paper back to him. I don't need time to consider it. I don't need to sleep on it. The Mercer homestead is not for sale. I understand your attachment to the property, but I want you to be aware that the current water rights situation, I'm aware of the water rights situation. Then you'll understand that if the Coronado's claim is established through the county court, the eastern field irrigation becomes untenable and the property's productive value drops, she said. I know. That's the mechanism. Squeeze the water rights, depress the value, make the offer look generous by comparison. She looked at him squarely. Tell whoever sent you that I understand the play, and tell them it won't work. Hargrove stood at her gate for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected this to be simpler. He put the paper back in his satchel. He put his hat on. The offer has a closing window of 30 days, he said. After that, we can't guarantee the terms. I'm not looking for a guarantee on terms I've already declined. He nodded. A professional nod, empty of either apology or judgment. Good day, Mrs. Mercer. He drove back down the road. She watched him go. The pitchfork was still in her hand. She hadn't realized how hard she'd been gripping it until he turned the corner and the tension went out of her arm all at once, and she became aware of the fact that her knees were not entirely steady. She went back into the barn and sat down on the feed chest and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she got up and finished mucking. She told Boone that afternoon. He was at the south fence line with the draw hoe and 2 replacement posts, working the last section she hadn't been able to get to before the ground softened badly. Pete wasn't with him today. It was just the 2 of them, and the cold coming off the ridge and the gray, flat sky of late November that meant serious weather was thinking about arriving. She told him about Hargrove straight through without editorializing. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she was done, he said, 30 days. That's what he said. That's the same window Grissom's lawyer needs to file the water rights challenge. He set the post in the hole and started packing earth around it. Their time together, pressure from 2 directions at once. She stood with her arms crossed against the cold. He planned this carefully. He's been planning it since before I arrived. Boone packed the earth in layers, the same method she used, the one that held. I've been looking through the Coronado's old agreements, the one your husband had with old Grissom, the verbal one. There's a letter, isn't there? In my deed box, 2 paragraphs, old Grissom's handwriting. You need to get that to a lawyer, not Hargrove, a different one. There's a man in Amarillo named Taggart, Marcus Taggart, who handles property disputes. He's honest, which is not a guarantee out here, but it's true about him. Boone looked up at her. He'll tell you if the letter holds any weight. Will it? He didn't rush the answer. It might establish good faith prior use. It's not a contract, but frontier courts have ruled on less. Depends on the judge. That costs money. It does. She looked at the fence line. The posts they'd set were solid. The work was good. Looking at it made her feel something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly. More like the recognition of effort made real. How much do you know about Marcus Taggart? She said. Enough. I used him once, about 6 years ago. Property matter up in the Panhandle. A pause. He did right by me. She noticed the specificity of that, about 6 years ago, up in the Panhandle, and noticed that she filed it away, adding it to the small collection of factual details she'd accumulated about Silas Boone, the way you accumulated evidence of something you hadn't decided yet whether to pursue. I'll write to him, she said. I can give you his address. Tonight, if you have it. He nodded. He went back to the post. She picked up the other tool and started clearing the trench for the next hole. They worked in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. They'd discovered somewhere over the past several weeks that silence between them didn't require filling, that they could occupy the same task without the social performance of conversation. Thomas had been like that with her. She'd forgotten that working quiet with someone was its own kind of language until it came back. Boone, she said. When Grissom finds out you sent me to Taggart, he already suspects I've been here more than fence posts require, Boone said. He hasn't said it directly. He'll get there. What happens then? He set the post, looked at the angle, adjusted it by a fraction. Then I'll have a conversation with Dale Grissom about where I stand. And where do you stand? He looked at her then. The light was going gray and flat, and the wind had picked up from the north, and she could see her breath, and his, and the fence line running true behind him. On the side of what's right, he said. Same place I was standing when I stopped on that road in October. She held his gaze. That's going to cost you the Coronado job. Maybe. He picked up the draw hoe. There are other jobs. Not in this county, not if Grissom blacklists you. Then there are other counties. He said it without drama, without performance. Just fact. I've started over before. She thought about what Lucy had said. He's very careful, like he's afraid of breaking something. She thought about it and looked at this man who was offering to lose his livelihood over a question of what was right, and she understood something then that she hadn't understood before. That the carefulness wasn't weakness. It was the caution of someone who knew exactly what things cost and was choosing to spend anyway. Why did you need Taggart 6 years ago? She said. The question landed in the air between them. He kept working for a moment. I had a property, he said finally. Small, up near Clarendon. I was running it with my brother. She waited. My brother made some decisions I didn't know about, borrowed against the land. By the time I knew, there wasn't enough left to hold on to. He straightened up. Taggart helped me get out clean. Didn't save the property, but he made sure I wasn't carrying debt that wasn't mine. And your brother? Gone west. We don't talk. He said it simply, the way you said things that had been painful long enough to become simply true. That's the short version. She nodded. She didn't push. She understood the short version. She had her own. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago. He meant it, the way you mean something once you've done the actual work of getting through it. Come on. We've got one more post before the light goes. She wrote to Marcus Taggart that night after Lucy was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas's old writing pen and the deed box open beside her. She copied out the relevant sections of old Grissom's letter word for word, being careful with the handwriting, making sure the details were exact. She described the nature of the water arrangement, the years of its use, the current challenge being organized by Dale Grissom's legal representative. She wrote 3 drafts before she was satisfied, not because she was uncertain of the facts, but because she wanted the letter to read like what it was. A clear-headed account from a woman who understood her situation and was not asking to be rescued from it, only for an honest legal assessment of where she stood. She sealed it and addressed it and set it by the door to take to the Caldwell Flats post office in the morning. Then she sat at the table for a while longer, not writing anything, just sitting with the open deed box and the papers in it. Thomas's handwriting on the purchase agreement, his name and hers together on the deed. A letter from his mother back in Ohio that she'd kept without quite knowing why. A single photograph taken the year after they arrived. Thomas standing in front of the barn that was now repaired, squinting into the sun, not smiling because he always forgot to smile for photographs, but with an expression that was clearly happiness just held too tightly to show its teeth. She put the photograph back. She thought about the offer, the number on Hargrove's folded paper, what that money would mean, the ease of it, the release from the arithmetic that never balanced, the ability to put Lucy somewhere with a real school and a roof that didn't need watching. She thought about Lucy at her drawing, the horse with enormous eyes, the practical assessment of Mr. Boone's sadness. She thought about the line of fence posts running solid and true across the south field. She closed the deed box. The first real snow came on a Friday, 6 inches overnight, and it changed the quality of everything the way first snow always did, muffled the sound, made the familiar strange, turned the fence lines into white arguments against the gray. Evelyn was out at first light to check on the animals and found the barn tight and dry, the repaired roof holding without a drip, and felt a specific and fierce gratitude for that. She was leading Bram back to his stall when she heard a rider coming up the road and felt her shoulders go tight because unexpected riders in November meant news, and November news was rarely the kind you wanted. It was Pete Delaney. He pulled up at the gate looking like a man who had been sent on an errand he wasn't comfortable with and was doing his best to complete it honestly. Mrs. Mercer. He held out an envelope. Mr. Boone asked me to bring this. She took it. Is he all right? Pete hesitated one beat too long. He's fine, ma'am. He just... Mr. Grissom found out he'd been coming out here. There was a conversation yesterday afternoon. He looked at his saddle horn, then back at her. He won't be able to come for a couple of weeks. Grissom's put him on back-to-back range work. It's not... He wanted you to know it wasn't his choice. She looked at the envelope. Did Grissom fire him? No, ma'am, not yet. The yet sat there between them, small and blunt. Mr. Boone said to read the letter. He said everything you need is in it. She thanked Pete. He rode back the way he'd come, and she stood in the snow with the envelope and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Boone's handwriting was plain and practical, the writing of a man who had no interest in penmanship but understood precision. Mrs. Mercer. Taggart's address as promised. Also enclosed is a document I've drafted based on my understanding of the water arrangement. It's not a legal document, but it lays out the history and usage in detail that might help Taggart build the case. Feel free to discard it if it's not useful. I'll be on the range for 2 weeks minimum. Pete can carry messages if you need to reach me. S. Boone. P.S. The east section of barn roof, the 3-foot section I mentioned, check it after the snow load comes off. If it's held, you're fine. If there's flex in the board, have Pete come get me regardless of Grissom's schedule. She read it twice. She folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket. Then she pulled it back out and read the postscript again. Have Pete come get me regardless of Grissom's schedule. Said plainly, without drama, as though it were simply a fact about priorities that didn't require explanation. She went inside and put the letter in the deed box with the others. The 2 weeks without him were clarifying in ways she hadn't expected. She'd told herself all through October and November that the arrangement was practical. Fence posts, barn roof, irrigation, work that needed doing and hands available to do it, exchanges of labor and lumber and fair payment, nothing that required a name beyond practical necessity. She'd told herself this firmly and repeatedly, the way you told yourself things you needed to believe. 2 weeks without him, and she became aware of the degree to which that story had been simplification. It wasn't that work fell apart without him. She managed. She'd been managing before he arrived. She managed now. The fence held and the barn held and the animals were fine. What she noticed was the quality of the days, a certain texture she'd been taking for granted, the presence of someone who worked beside her without performing helpfulness, who said the true thing when she asked for it, who left his horse at the road and packed fence posts in layers, and didn't need her to be different than she was. She noticed she was talking to Lucy more, not because she'd been talking to Lucy less before, but because she'd become aware of the silence that didn't quite have the same shape as it had in the early days after Thomas died, the silence that wasn't absence anymore, but wasn't fullness either. She was 41. She had not thought much about what came after survival. Survival had been sufficient as a goal for a year. It had taken up all the available space. She was becoming aware that available space existed. She didn't know what to do with that awareness. She set it aside the way you set aside something fragile that you're not sure how to carry yet. And she kept working, and she wrote a follow-up letter to Marcus Taggart, and she checked the East Barn section after the snow load came off. The board had held. Dale Grissom came to the homestead himself on a Tuesday in December, which was both surprising and not. He didn't send Hargrove. He came himself, on a big roan stallion that was considerably showier than anything a working ranch required. And he came alone, which she read as a deliberate signal. I don't need backup for this. You are not a situation that requires resources. She was on the porch when he rode up. She'd seen him at a distance before, in town, but never this close. He was younger than she'd expected from his reputation. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who had inherited authority and worn it long enough that it sat on him naturally. He had a pleasant face, which somehow made him worse. He stopped at her gate and took his hat off. Manners. She could already see how this was going to be played, and she felt her jaw tighten. Mrs. Mercer, Dale Grissom, I believe we have some mutual interest to discuss. Mr. Grissom. She didn't move from the porch. My answer to Mr. Hargrove's offer stands. I'm not here about the offer. He smiled, easy, unhurried. I'm here as a neighbor. We haven't properly met, and I think that's been a mistake. He looked around the property with the particular gaze of a man assessing an asset. You've done impressive work here, managing this on your own. That's not nothing. I'm aware of that. The water rights situation. He shook his head as though it were an unfortunate thing that had arrived independent of his involvement. That's a legal process, and I want you to know it's nothing personal. The Coronado's claim on the creek predates the shared arrangement, and my lawyers tell me we have an obligation to establish that formally. An obligation, she said, to the ranch, to the investors. He spread his hands. It's business, Mrs. Mercer. I take no pleasure in it. She looked at him across the gate. The snow had come off the south field in patches, and the fence posts she and Boone had set were standing clean and exact in the gray December light. Mr. Grissom, she said, I understand that you want this property. I understand the mechanism you're using to make it difficult to hold. I understand that you've put your foreman on range duty to make it harder for me to get help with repairs. She paused. I want you to understand something in return. He kept his pleasant expression. Of course. I have retained legal counsel in Amarillo regarding the water arrangement, she said. I have documentation of 22 years of shared water use on this creek, including written correspondence from your father's own hand. My attorney believes that establishes good faith prior use that predates any formal Coronado claim. She watched something move behind his eyes. I am also prepared to make the details of the water rights challenge public in a way that allows the community to understand exactly what kind of business practice is being conducted here. Grissom's pleasant expression had not entirely disappeared, but it had become effortful. That would be an unfortunate path, he said. Then close the legal process and honor your father's arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment. The roan shifted under him. In the barn, old Bram made a sound of hoarse opinion about something. You're more prepared than I expected, Grissom said finally. The pleasantness had gone out of his voice. What was left was more honest and considerably colder. Who helped you get ready for this conversation? I prepared myself. Boone give you Taggart's name? She met his eyes. I don't have anything to say about Mr. Boone. I do. Grissom put his hat back on. Boone's employment at the Coronado is under review. I want to be clear that any assistance he's been providing here has been done without my authorization and potentially in violation of his contractual obligations to the ranch. If you fire him for helping a neighbor repair fence posts and a barn roof, you'll need to explain that publicly. I don't need to explain anything publicly. Maybe not. She looked straight at him. But Caldwell Flats is a small town, Mr. Grissom. People watch. You know that as well as I do. The silence between them held for a moment. A crow called from somewhere up on the ridge and flew south, black against the white-gray sky. Grissom gathered his reins. 30 days on Hargrove's offer, Mrs. Mercer. The clock is still running. Then it'll run out, she said. He rode away. She watched him until he was around the bend. Her legs were shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear. There was anger in it, and something that felt almost like exhilaration, the particular feeling of having said the true thing directly to the person it needed to be said to, and not back down from it. She went inside. Lucy was at the table with her charcoal, working on something new. She looked up. Was that Mr. Grissom? It was. What did he want? Evelyn sat down. Her legs were steadier now. He wanted to make sure I was frightened. Are you? She thought about that honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things honestly since October, Since a man had helped pull her wagon out of the mud and told her the straight version and left his horse at the road. "A little," she said, "but less than he wanted me to be." Lucy looked at her with those serious eyes. "Good," she said. She went back to her drawing. "I think we should tell Mr. Boone. I'll send word with Pete. Today?" "Today." Lucy nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suggestion has been accepted on reasonable grounds. She pressed her charcoal to the paper and continued whatever she was making. Evelyn still couldn't tell what it was, just that it had the same large, careful eyes everything did, and that whatever it was looking out at you with the calm expectation of being seen clearly in return. Pete came that afternoon. She gave him a short note, just the facts, Grissom's visit, the conversation, the threat about Boone's employment, the water rights status. She didn't dress it up and she didn't ask for anything specific. She wrote at the bottom, "You don't need to come. I wanted you to know." Pete wrote out. The afternoon went gray and cold, the kind of cold that got into the gaps in the walls, and she spent the remaining light doing the small interior work of a winter homestead, checking food stores, inventorying what she'd need before the roads got bad, looking at the money in the tin that was not a deed box but an actual money tin, and doing the arithmetic that was, for the first time in several months, slightly less grim than usual. She'd been paying Boone for the lumber and the labor in small amounts when she had it. She'd kept account of it, meticulous, because the accounting mattered to her even when no one was checking. What she found when she looked at it clearly was that the repairs to the property had cost her less than the deterioration would have, and that the Eastfield irrigation was going to produce in spring in a way it hadn't been going to produce before, and that the numbers, while not comfortable, were survivable in a way they hadn't been in October. She sat with that for a while. Survivable. It was funny, she thought, how the word had changed. In October it had been the ceiling, if I can survive this, and now it was the floor, the base from which something else might be built. She heard horses on the road again around dusk and felt the spike of tension, and then she heard the specific hoofbeats of the gray quarter horse, and the tension changed into something that was not exactly tension. She opened the door before he knocked. Boone stood on her porch in the early dark, hat in his hand, snow on his coat from the Ridge Road. He looked like a man who had made a decision on a horse ride and arrived at the other end of it. "Pete gave me your note," he said. "You didn't need to come tonight." "I know." He held her gaze. "Grissom called me in this afternoon after he got back from here. He told me my employment was conditional on ending my involvement with the Mercer property." She went still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He paused. "I thought about it for about 40 minutes on the ride over." She waited. "I'm going to resign," he said. "Before he fires me. There's a difference, and it matters." He looked at her steadily. "I want to propose something, not a personal arrangement, a business one, a written partnership for the spring season. I put in labor and expertise, you put in the land and the cattle. We split the profit on the spring and summer yield." He took a breath. "It's fair by any measure, and it gives you something to show Taggart and the county if Grissom tries to argue you can't sustain the property independently." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them pretended this was a simple proposal. "A written partnership," she said. "Terms that we both agree to and sign. Equal say in decisions about the property. I don't own anything. I earn a portion of what we produce together." He paused. "If it doesn't work, you have a signed document showing exactly what the arrangement was and what each party contributed. There's nothing anyone can use against you." She leaned against the doorframe. Outside, the dark had come down fully, and the snow on the south field caught what little light there was and made the fence line faintly visible. "You'd give up a foreman's salary," she said. "I'd give up working for a man I don't respect," he said. That's different. It's a significant risk. For both of us." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the deed box and the papers. She thought about Hargrove and Grissom and the 30-day clock. She thought about the arithmetic, the numbers that were survivable, but not yet something more than that. She thought about Lucy drawing horses with enormous eyes, looking out calm and steady, expecting to be seen clearly. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee and we'll talk through the terms." He came in. She made coffee, strong, the kind that could have stripped paint off a wagon wheel, and they sat at the kitchen table where she'd signed papers and made plans and sat alone with the deed box more times than she could count, and they talked through it. Not quickly, not smoothly. They disagreed on 2 of the initial terms and had to work back through the logic of each until they arrived at language they both found fair. And at one point, Evelyn made a point about the cattle yield split that she felt strongly about, and Boone pushed back and she pushed back harder, and he thought about it and said she was right. And the whole process had the uncomfortable, productive feeling of 2 people being honest with each other in real time. Lucy appeared at the kitchen doorway around 8 o'clock in her nightclothes, looking at both of them with the unsurprised assessment of a child who has processed more change than most adults and finds new situations manageable. "Are you staying?" she asked Boone. "He's going back to the Coronado tonight," Evelyn said. "We're working on a business arrangement." "Oh." Lucy considered this. "Are you going to stop working for the mean man?" Boone looked at her. "I am." Lucy nodded, thoroughly satisfied. "Good," she said. "You work better here anyway." She looked at her mother. "Can I have water?" Evelyn got her water. She went back to bed. They went back to the terms. Outside, the snow had started again, fine and steady, coming down quiet over the repaired barn and the solid fence, and the irrigation channel that would run clear in spring, covering everything in the patient white of a season that didn't ask your permission and didn't wait for you to be ready. That just came and expected you to find a way to be standing on the other side of it. They signed the partnership agreement on a Thursday morning with Margaret Holt and her husband Walt as witnesses, because Margaret was the closest thing Caldwell Flats had to a notary, and because Evelyn had decided, after considerable thought, that having witnesses who would talk was better than having witnesses who wouldn't. She was right about that. By Friday afternoon, half the town knew. The document itself was 4 pages, handwritten in Evelyn's careful script, with Boone's corrections in the margins where they disagreed and negotiated, and arrived at language they both found honest. It laid out the terms plainly. Boone would provide labor, expertise, and his own tools for the duration of the spring and summer working season. Evelyn retained full ownership of the land, the cattle, and all structures. Decisions about the property required agreement from both parties. Profit from the spring cattle yield and the Eastfield harvest would be divided 60-40 in Evelyn's favor, with the split adjusting toward equal if Boone's labor contribution exceeded a defined threshold. Either party could dissolve the arrangement with 30 days written notice. It was not a romantic document. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be fair and clear and defensible, and it was all 3 of those things. And when Marcus Taggart received a copy in Amarillo 3 days later, he wrote back that it was the most sensibly constructed frontier labor agreement he'd seen in 20 years of property law, which Evelyn read aloud to Boone at the kitchen table, and which made him look quietly pleased in the way he looked when something had been done correctly. Taggart also wrote that old Grissom's letter, combined with the documented history of water use, gave them a reasonable case for prior rights. Not certain. Nothing in county court was certain, but reasonable. He recommended filing a preemptive claim to establish their position before Grissom's lawyer could frame the argument first. "How much?" Boone said. She told him what Taggart had quoted. He nodded slowly. "I have most of that, from the Coronado severance." She looked at him. "Grissom gave you severance." "He was going to fire me anyway. I think he calculated that severance was cheaper than a dispute." A pause. "He was probably right. I'm not taking your severance money. It would be a loan against my share of the spring yield." He met her eyes. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm investing it. There's a difference." She looked at the partnership document sitting between them on the table. 4 pages of careful, non-romantic language about thresholds and adjustments and 30-day notices. "We'd need to add an amendment," she said. "I know. I already drafted it." He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and set it on the table. She stared at him. "When did you draft it?" "Last night, before I came over." "You assumed I'd agree." "I assumed you'd see the logic." He held her gaze without flinching. "If I was wrong, you'd have told me by now." She picked up the amendment. She read it. The language was fair, the loan structured with clear repayment terms, interest at a reasonable frontier rate, no claim on property if the yield fell short, just an extension of the repayment period. He'd thought it through properly. She set it down. She looked at him sitting across her kitchen table in the gray January light, a man who had given up a foreman's salary and his severance money and his standing in the county for a written agreement about fence posts and cattle yield and a piece of land that wasn't his. "Why?" she said. Not for the first time, but the first time she'd asked it without already suspecting she didn't want the real answer. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "Because the right thing and the easy thing stopped being the same thing for me a long time ago," he said. "And I found that when they diverge, I can live with hard. I can't live with wrong." He looked at the table, then back up at her. "And because this place is worth fighting for, you're worth fighting for. I don't think you need me to tell you that, but I'm saying it anyway." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not a business reason," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She picked up her pen. She signed the amendment. She slid it across to him, and he signed it, and they sat there with the papers between them and the coffee going cold, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but was honest, which was something. "The South cattle need moving to the upper pasture before February," she said finally. He nodded. "I'll start on the gates tomorrow. The lower gate hinge is rusted through. I'll bring a new one." She got up to reheat the coffee. Outside, January had the land in a hard grip, the kind of cold that made wood contract and water freeze in the pipes before morning and turned the world into a lesson in what it meant to be truly, fundamentally serious about getting through something. They had work to do. The first week of their formal partnership was not graceful. This was something Evelyn had not fully anticipated, that having a partner created its own specific friction, separate from and in addition to all the other friction that came with running a property in winter. She was accustomed to deciding things herself, to the efficiency of a single mind running through a problem and arriving at a solution without the intermediate step of another person's opinion. Boone was not a man who deferred easily. He had his own methods, developed over 2 decades of working land, and his methods were not always hers, and he was not shy about saying so. The first argument happened over the cattle rotation. She wanted to move the herd to the upper pasture in 2 groups, splitting the weaker animals out to keep them from being pushed off feed. He thought one consolidated move was better, less stress on the animals overall, cleaner management. They went back and forth on it for longer than either of them was proud of, standing in the cold south field with the cattle making their opinions known in the background, neither willing to simply yield. She did it her way in the end because it was her land, and the agreement gave her that right, and the herd moved without incident, and the weaker animals fed well. She didn't make a point of being right about it. He didn't concede it graciously either. They worked through the afternoon without speaking much, and at the end of it he said, "You were right about the split." And she said, "Your logic wasn't wrong," and that was the entirety of it, and somehow it was enough. The second argument was about the east gate repair, which she had a specific method for that he thought was inefficient, and he was correct that it was inefficient. And she told him to do it his way, and he did. And the gate worked better than it had in 2 years, and that was also enough. What she was discovering was that partnership required a particular kind of ongoing negotiation that didn't resolve into a final state. There was no moment when you had fully figured out how to do it. You just kept doing it, daily, sometimes badly, sometimes well, recalibrating as you went. It was exhausting and occasionally maddening, and it was producing results that neither of them could have produced alone. The Eastfield irrigation ran clear in January for the first time in 3 seasons. The cattle were in better condition than they'd been the previous February. The barn was tight and dry, and the fence lines ran solid from the south boundary to the creek. The creek, which was still contested, which was still the center of the legal argument being built by 2 different lawyers in 2 different directions, which was still running, quiet and indifferent to human disputes, along the eastern edge of property that Evelyn Mercer intended to hold. Grissom's response to the partnership filing was swift and characteristically indirect. He didn't come back to the homestead. He sent instead a letter through his Amarillo lawyer claiming that Boone's partnership agreement with the Mercer homestead represented a conflict of interest with proprietary information Boone had accessed during his time as Coronado foreman, and that the syndicate was considering legal action on those grounds. Boone read the letter at the kitchen table. His face was very still. "Is it true?" Evelyn asked. Not accusatory. She needed to know. I didn't take anything from the Coronado. His voice was even. No documents, no records. I told you about the water rights situation based on what I observed in my capacity as foreman. That's not proprietary. That's what any neighbor would know. Taggart needs to see this. Taggart already knows about it. I wrote to him before Grissom's lawyer did. He set the letter down. This is noise. It's Grissom trying to make the legal fight expensive enough that you decide the offer was the better option. I know what it is. She picked up the letter, folded it, put it in the deed box. The deed box was getting full. What I want to know is whether it puts you at legal risk. He looked at her. You're asking if I'm going to become a liability. I'm asking if you're going to be all right. The distinction landed between them. He was quiet for a moment. Taggart says the conflict of interest claim has no standing, he said. I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement with the Coronado. Grissom didn't require them from his foreman, which was his mistake. A pause. I'll be all right. She nodded. She didn't push further. But she noticed that he'd answered the second question, not the first. That he'd registered the difference between will you be a problem and will you be okay, and had answered the one that was about him rather than about her convenience, and that this told her something she filed away without comment. The county court date is March 7th, she said. Taggart confirmed that this morning. Are we ready? He looked at her. We're as ready as we can be. The letter, the usage history, the partnership document, the amendment. Taggart says the judge is fair. Taggart said reasonable, she corrected. Reasonable and fair are different things. He almost smiled at that. You're right. I usually am, she said. You're learning. This time he did smile, brief and genuine, and it changed his face the way weather changed a landscape. Not fundamentally different, just suddenly more of itself. Well, word of the court date got through Caldwell Flats the way everything got through Caldwell Flats, which was immediately and with embellishment. By the first week of February, the water rights case had become the primary conversational currency of the town, and the positions people took on it said interesting things about who they were. Margaret Holt was openly supportive, having signed the partnership document and having watched Evelyn Mercer manage alone for a year with her own eyes and drawn her own conclusions. Walt Holt said nothing publicly, but made sure Boone's supply orders were filled first and without surcharge, which was its own kind of statement. Dorothy Vance continued to have concerns about appearances, which she expressed to anyone who would hold still long enough. 3 of the Coronado ranch hands who'd been let go in December, Grissom's staff reduction after losing Boone, quietly let it be known that they thought Grissom's water claim was manufactured, though they said it in the careful language of men who needed to be employable in this county for the foreseeable future. Pete Delaney, who was still at the Coronado and carrying a visible amount of guilt about it, showed up at the homestead on a Saturday with his own tools and asked if there was anything needed. Boone told him the north fence could use a second pair of hands. Pete worked all morning without asking to be paid. He went back to the Coronado in the afternoon, and neither spoke of it again. The community was not united, and it was not unkind in its divisions. It was human, which meant it was complicated and inconsistent and occasionally surprising in both directions. Evelyn moved through it the way she moved through most things, directly, without excessive explanation, doing the work that needed doing and letting people draw whatever conclusions they were going to draw. What she hadn't counted on was Lucy. Lucy had been watching the winter's developments with the patient attention of a child who had learned that adult situations required observation before they required opinion. She'd been helpful in concrete ways, keeping herself fed on mornings when Evelyn and Boone were working before breakfast, doing the small indoor tasks without being asked, doing her homework at the table when they were working on partnership paperwork rather than climbing on people and demanding attention. But February brought a change. The change was specific and happened on a Wednesday when Miss Delaney dismissed school early for weather, and Lucy came home to find Boone working on the barn's east door hinges and went and stood beside him without being invited and handed him tools when he needed them in a sequence that suggested she'd been paying closer attention to mechanical work than anyone had specifically taught her. He let her. He explained what he was doing without condescending to her, treating her questions as legitimate, answering them honestly, including once when the honest answer was, "I'm not entirely sure. Let me think about that," rather than inventing a confident response. Evelyn watched from the porch for a while before she went back inside. She told herself she was going in because there was bread to start and laundry to deal with. Both things were true. They were not the complete truth. The complete truth was that what she'd seen in the barn doorway, Lucy handing up a wrench, Boone explaining the hinge mechanism, the easy back and forth of two people comfortable with each other's presence, was something she needed to be away from for a few minutes while she sorted out what she felt about it. What she felt was complicated. Glad, primarily. But glad in the way that touches something tender, the way you're glad about something that also costs you a little. And the cost was not something she could have fully named except that it had to do with Thomas, and with the specific loneliness of watching your child find a footing in the world that doesn't include someone who should have been there to provide it. She started the bread. She was fine by the time they came in. "The east door won't drag anymore," Lucy announced. "Good," Evelyn said. "Mr. Boone says the wood swelled from the wet December. He says it'll probably do it again next winter." "He's right. He says we should plane the bottom edge in autumn before the wet season." Lucy sat at the table and pulled her school reader toward her. "I think we should do it in September." "We," Evelyn said. Lucy looked up. "Me and Mr. Boone. We decided." Boone had come in behind her and was washing his hands at the basin. He met Evelyn's eyes briefly over Lucy's head. His expression said, "I didn't suggest it. I didn't discourage it either." She looked at her daughter, who had gone back to her reader with the serene confidence of someone who has made a reasonable plan and sees no particular obstacle to it. "We." Such a small word, such a specific weight. "September is reasonable," Evelyn said. The court date arrived on a Thursday that was cold and clear, the kind of winter day that felt like a held breath. Taggart had come up from Amarillo himself, which Evelyn hadn't expected, and which Boone had arranged without telling her, which was the kind of thing that could have annoyed her and didn't, because she understood by now that Boone's arrangements were not about control, but about problem-solving, and the problem being solved was real. Taggart was older than she'd pictured, late 60s, with the unhurried precision of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to know that urgency and competence were different things. He reviewed the documents with her for an hour at the Caldwell Flats courthouse before the session, and he was direct in the way she'd come to value. No reassurances he couldn't back up, no minimizing of the risk. "Judge Howell is fair," he said. "He's also cautious. He doesn't like manufactured disputes any more than I do, and Grissom's claim has the smell of one. But the letter from old Grissom is not a contract, and I want you to be clear that we're arguing for recognition of established practice, not for the letter itself." "I understand," she said. "If it goes against us, we appeal. The appeal process takes time, but we have a stronger case on appeal with the usage history documented." He looked at her over his glasses. "We may not win today." "I know. Most clients don't actually know that," he said. "They say it, and they don't know it." "I've been managing a homestead alone for a year," she said. "I know what it looks like when something might not work." He nodded, satisfied. "Then let's go see what we can do." Grissom's lawyer was a man named Caulfield, younger than Hargrove, with the sharp efficiency of someone who had prepared this argument carefully and believed in its strength. He presented the Coronado's claim cleanly. The deed records, the survey lines, the argument that without a formal water-sharing agreement, the Coronado held exclusive rights to the creek that formed the eastern boundary. Taggart presented old Grissom's letter. He presented 22 years of property records showing uninterrupted shared water use. He presented 3 signed statements from other property holders in the area who had direct knowledge of the arrangement. He did not overstate any of it. He did not perform confidence he didn't have. He laid it out plainly and let it be what it was. Judge Howell asked questions for 40 minutes. He asked them of both sides, and his questions were sharp. And twice he asked Caulfield things that Caulfield had to take a moment to answer. And once he asked Taggart something that Taggart answered directly and without hesitation, and the judge nodded at that answer in the way judges nodded when they'd heard what they needed to hear. He didn't rule that day. He said he'd have a decision within 2 weeks. Evelyn came out of the courthouse into the cold, clear air and stood on the steps while Taggart talked to her about next steps and contingencies. And she listened to all of it, and when Taggart was done, she thanked him and watched him go to his buggy. And then she stood there for a moment longer by herself. Boone was at the base of the steps. He'd been in the courtroom. She'd been aware of him there the way she was always aware of him now, without looking directly. But he'd let her have the conversation with Taggart. He was looking at her now. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She came down the steps. They walked to where the horses were tied without talking, which was their way. And it was enough. The 2 weeks were the longest of the winter. She worked. That was the only answer she had to waiting, and it was the same answer she'd had to grief and fear and loneliness, and it had never been a perfect answer, but it had always been the right one. She worked, and Boone worked beside her, and the homestead moved toward spring the way it needed to. The fence lines were the best they'd been since Thomas died. The cattle were healthy. The east field irrigation was clear and ready. The barn was tight on all 4 sides, the east door swung clean, and the northwest roof section that had let in 3 stars on a clear night was solid and dry. She found, working through those 2 weeks, that she had stopped doing something she hadn't realized she'd been doing. She'd stopped bracing. The constant low-level tensing against the next thing that might go wrong had been her default state for a year, and somewhere in the accumulated work of winter, it had loosened, and she noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a noise you'd stopped hearing. It didn't mean everything was fine. Plenty wasn't fine. The court decision was still pending. The syndicate offer's 30 days had technically expired, but Hargrove had sent a follow-up letter suggesting the terms could be revisited, which meant Grissom hadn't given up. Money was still tight. The spring would bring its own problems. But the bracing had stopped. She mentioned this to no one. It was not the kind of thing she would have known how to mention, and most of the people she might have mentioned it to wouldn't have understood it anyway. Boone would have understood it. She thought about saying it to him one evening when they were going over the spring planting schedule at the kitchen table, and she didn't. And he looked up from the paperwork and looked at her with those level eyes and said, "You seem different lately." She raised an eyebrow. Different how? He considered it. Less like you're waiting for the floor to go out. She looked at him for a moment. When did you notice? About 3 weeks ago. He went back to the planting schedule. It's a good change. She went back to the schedule too. Outside, the February wind moved through the fence lines that held, across the field that was ready, past the barn that was tight and dry and not going anywhere. Boone, she said. Whatever the court decides. She kept her eyes on the paper. I want you to know that this winter, what we've done here, it would have mattered regardless. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him being careful with the response, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the weight of what she'd said and was treating it accordingly. It mattered to me too, he said, from the beginning. She nodded. She didn't look up. He didn't push for more than that, because he understood by now that with Evelyn Mercer, what was said was what was meant, and what was meant didn't require amplification. Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightclothes, as she did with reliable timing at moments that seemed designed to prevent adult conversations from going any further than they were ready to go. Can I have water? You always want water, Evelyn said. I'm always thirsty. Boone got up and got her water and handed it to her, and she drank it and looked at both of them with those enormous observant eyes and said, You're doing the planting schedule. We are, Evelyn said. Are we putting in more corn this year? We're thinking about it. We should, Lucy said. Mr. Boone says the east field can hold more volume now that the irrigation is right. She handed the cup back and looked at Boone. Right? That's what I said, he agreed. I think 40 acres of corn and 30 of hay, Lucy said, with the complete confidence of a 7-year-old who has been listening to adult conversations for several months and has formed positions. That's what I think. Evelyn looked at Boone. He looked at Evelyn. Something passed between them that was almost laughter, held back by mutual agreement. Go to bed, Evelyn said. Lucy went to bed, satisfied. They went back to the planting schedule, and the lamp burned low, and outside the February wind was cold, but the fence held and the roof held and the walls held, and the deed box in the kitchen had 4 pages of partnership agreement in it, and 3 pages of amendment, and a stack of Taggart's correspondence, and the photograph of Thomas squinting into the sun, and all of it sat there together in the same box, without contradiction. The ruling came on a Monday, delivered by the county clerk to the Caldwell Flats post office, and Margaret Holt sent her nephew Billy to the homestead with it before noon, because she had read the outside of the envelope and made a reasonable guess about what was inside and could not have held it until Tuesday supply day, even at gunpoint. Evelyn was in the east field with Boone, marking the spring planting grid, when Billy came galloping up the road with the envelope held over his head like a flag. She took it. She stood in the field with the cold February sun on her face and Boone beside her and the envelope in her hand, and she did not open it immediately, because the moment before you know something is still the last moment before everything might be different, and she gave herself 3 seconds of it. Then she opened it. Taggart's cover letter was on top, 2 paragraphs. She read the first sentence of the first paragraph. I am pleased to inform you that Judge Howell has ruled in favor of the established water usage rights for the Mercer homestead. She read it again. She read it a third time to make sure the words were in the order she thought they were in. Then she handed it to Boone without a word, and looked out at the east field, at the irrigation channel running clean and ready, at the fence line and the barn and the house, and the 140 acres that had her husband's name and her daughter's future in its soil. And she felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for and didn't need one. Boone read the letter. He handed it back. Grissom can appeal, he said. I know. She folded the letter. Taggart says the basis for appeal is narrow. Still. She put the letter in her coat pocket. We keep working. Yes. Billy Holt was still sitting on his horse, watching them with the hopeful attention of a young man who has delivered important news and would like to know how it landed. Tell your aunt thank you for sending you, Evelyn said. Billy grinned and rode back toward town, and they both knew that by the time he got there, Margaret would have already heard the news somehow, because that was Caldwell Flats, and that by evening the whole town would know, and that the knowing would produce its own complicated variety of responses. But right now it was just the two of them standing in the east field in the February cold with the planting grid half marked on the ground and the work not done yet and the season coming regardless. Boone picked up the marking stake he'd set down. 40 acres corn, he said. 30 hay. She looked at him. She thought about Lucy at the kitchen table, confident as a compass needle. She thought about Thomas squinting into the sun. She thought about October mud and a gray quarter horse and a man who left his horse at the road because he didn't want to assume he was welcome. Lucy was right, she said. She usually is, he said. Evelyn picked up her own stake. The ground was hard and the air was cold and the spring was still 6 weeks away, and there was everything still to do. She drove the stake in and moved to the next mark. Grissom filed his appeal in the first week of March. Taggart sent word the same day he received the filing, which meant Evelyn heard about it before the ink was dry on the courthouse documents, and she appreciated that about him. The man did not believe in cushioning bad news with delay. The letter was 3 paragraphs. What Grissom had filed, the legal grounds he was claiming, and Taggart's honest assessment of those grounds, which was that they were thin but not frivolous, and that a different judge on appeal could read the prior use doctrine differently than Howell had. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her and Boone across from her waiting, and when she was done she set it down and looked out the window at the east field where the planting grid stakes were still standing from Monday. He's not giving up, she said. No. Boone had his own copy, Taggart having sent 2. He set it on the table. But Taggart says thin. Thin isn't none. No, it isn't. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, put it down. How much will the appeal cost? He told her what Taggart had estimated. It was not a number that made anything easier. It was, in fact, a number that undid several weeks of careful arithmetic and put them back in uncomfortable territory. She sat with that. The spring yield, she said. If the east field produces what we're planning, we cover the legal costs and have something left. He paused. If the weather holds. Weather on the frontier holds when it wants to. Yes. She looked at the window again. The morning was gray and cold. The particular gray of early March that wasn't winter anymore, but wasn't spring yet either. That ambiguous territory where the land looked exhausted and you had to take it on faith that it knew what it was doing. We plant on schedule, she said. We don't change anything because of the appeal. That's what Grissom wants. He wants us distracted and reactive. Boone nodded. Agreed. And I'm going to write to Taggart today about the appeal timeline. I want to understand exactly when we need to have the legal costs available and plan around that date. I'll ride to the post office this afternoon if you have the letter ready. She picked up her pen. She was already composing the letter in her head. She wrote quickly, without drafts this time. She knew what she wanted to say and said it, and the letter was done in 20 minutes and sealed in 25. And Boone took it to town, and she went out to the east field and drove 3 more planting stakes into the cold ground before noon. That was how you answered an appeal. You kept working. You didn't let the legal argument become the only argument happening. The Consolidated Western Land Syndicate made one more approach in mid-March. It wasn't Hargrove this time. It was a different man, someone Evelyn didn't recognize, who arrived not at her gate but at the Caldwell Flats Mercantile while she was doing her weekly supply run, and he introduced himself as a regional director of the syndicate and asked if she had a few minutes. She said she had exactly as many minutes as it took to hear what he had to say. He was smoother than Hargrove, younger, with the polished manner of someone who had been trained to read people and adjust accordingly. He offered her coffee, which she declined, and he said he appreciated her directness, which she recognized as a technique, and he said the syndicate had revised their offer upward in light of the recent court ruling. The new number was significantly higher than the first one, high enough that she felt it land, felt the specific weight of what it could mean, the security of it, the finality, the end of the particular grinding uncertainty she had been living inside for a year and a half. She looked at the revised offer on the paper he'd slid across the mercantile counter. Margaret Holt was behind the counter pretending to arrange tins. She was doing a poor job of pretending. "Why?" Evelyn said. The man blinked. "I'm sorry? Why is it higher? We won the water rights ruling. The property is more viable now than it was when Hargrove made the first offer. That should make you less motivated to buy, not more." She looked at him steadily. "So why is it higher?" He recovered quickly. She gave him that. "The syndicate values this corridor of land for regional development purposes, and we've revised our assessment of the property's long-term. Grissom's appeal is going to fail," she said. "You've had your own legal assessment done, and you know the appeal is thin. So this offer is about getting the property before the appeal fails and the price goes up further." She folded the paper and handed it back. "I'm not interested." The smooth manner slipped just slightly, just enough. "Mrs. Mercer, I'd encourage you to consider the security this represents for your daughter's—" "My daughter's future is on that land," she said. "That's where it's been since before she could walk. That's where it's going to stay." She picked up her supplies. She nodded to Margaret, who was no longer pretending to arrange tins and was watching with unconcealed interest. "Good day," Evelyn said. She walked out. She got into the wagon. She sat for a moment in the cold March air before she gathered the reins, because her heart was going faster than she wanted, and she needed it to slow down before she drove. She had not told the syndicate man that the revised offer had made her breathe differently for exactly 30 seconds. That she had held that paper and felt, for 30 seconds, the pull of the easier thing. That it had taken something real to fold it back up and hand it over. She didn't need anyone to know that. She knew it herself, and that was sufficient. And what she also knew was that she'd handed it back anyway, and that the 30 seconds of wanting the easier thing and choosing the harder one was not a weakness. It was the whole point. It didn't count for anything if it didn't cost you something. She gathered the reins and drove home. She told Boone that evening. She told him the complete version, including the 30 seconds. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You told me," he said, "about the 30 seconds. "Yes." "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked at him across the table. "I told you because I wanted to. Because I think honesty between partners means the uncomfortable parts too, not just the easy accounting." He nodded slowly. His hands were around his coffee cup. He looked at them for a moment and then back at her. "My brother," he said. "The property in Clarendon. I told you the short version." She waited. "The long version is that I knew for about 3 months that something was wrong before I admitted it to myself. There were signs. The way he talked around certain things, the way some of the accounts didn't add up right when I looked at them. I didn't push because he was my brother and I wanted to believe he was who I thought he was." He paused. "By the time I admitted what I knew, there wasn't enough left to fix." She looked at him. "You blame yourself." "I blame myself," he said. Past tense. "It took a while to get there." He looked up. The point is, I know what it costs to look at the hard thing directly, and I know what it costs not to. He held her gaze. You've been looking directly at everything since October, every time. That's not nothing, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her first name. Not her last name, not Mrs. Mercer. Just her name, said plainly, the way you said the name of someone you'd stopped being careful about. She felt it. She didn't pretend she didn't. Silas, she said, testing the weight of it. He didn't look away. Neither did she. The appeal hearing is in 6 weeks, she said. It is? We'll have the first corn in the ground by then. We will. She got up and rinsed her cup at the basin. Her hands were steady. She was becoming accustomed to the specific feeling of choosing steadiness when the alternative was available. Stay for supper tomorrow, she said. Her back was to him. Lucy's been asking why you leave before dinner. A pause behind her. What did you tell her? I told her you had things to see to. She turned around. You don't, particularly. Not in the evenings. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was careful and decided, both at once. All right, he said. Tomorrow. Spring on the frontier did not arrive gracefully, and it did not apologize for the mess it made. It came in with mud and standing water, and the particular chaos of land thawing unevenly, frozen solid in one patch and ankle-deep in the next, the kind of conditions that tested equipment and patience in equal measure. They planted through it. It was not clean work, and it was not easy work, and there were mornings when Evelyn pulled on her boots in the dark and went out to find conditions that required replanning everything they'd decided the day before, and there were afternoons when the equipment failed at critical moments. The seed drill jamming on the third day of corn planting, the irrigation valve sticking closed when the first dry spell hit in early April. And they dealt with each problem in the order it arrived, and they did not have the luxury of being discouraged for long. Boone was at the homestead most days by first light. He stayed for supper most evenings. This had become, gradually and without formal announcement, the shape of things. Lucy had accepted it with the thoroughness of a child who had decided something was correct and didn't understand why it would require further discussion. She sat 3 places at the table without being asked. She reported on her school day to both of them with the even-handed attention of someone delivering a briefing to an audience she considered equally relevant. She asked Boone questions about horses and fences and cattle with the focused inquiry of a person building a knowledge base, and he answered them with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which Lucy found appropriate and Evelyn found quietly devastating in the best possible way. One evening in April, after supper, Lucy was at the table working on a drawing and Boone was reviewing the irrigation schedule and Evelyn was mending a harness strap, and the lamp was burning and the fire was going, and outside the spring rain was coming down on the east field where the corn was in the ground and starting, and Lucy looked up from her drawing without particular preamble and said, "Mr. Boone, are you going to stay here forever?" The room was very quiet for a moment. Boone set down the irrigation schedule. He looked at Lucy with the seriousness her questions deserved. "I don't know about forever," he said. "That's a long time. But you're not going to leave soon." "No." "Because of the partnership agreement?" "Partly." Lucy considered this. "What's the other part?" Evelyn kept her eyes on the harness strap. Her hands had stopped moving. Boone was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding, the way she'd learned to feel when he was deciding between the careful version and the true one. "Because I want to be here," he said. "Because this is the best place I've been in a long time, and the people in it are worth being around." A pause. "Is that a sufficient answer?" Lucy thought about it with genuine consideration. "Yes," she said. She went back to her drawing. "I'm going to put you in the picture." "What picture?" She held it up. It was the east field. Evelyn could recognize it from the fence line, rendered in Lucy's big-eyed style. Everything slightly larger than life. There was a figure at the fence that was clearly meant to be Evelyn. There was a smaller figure beside her that was clearly Lucy. And there was a space to the left that Lucy was now filling in with confident charcoal strokes. "The field needs 3 people," Lucy said. "It always looked like it had room for 3. Evelyn put down the harness strap. She didn't trust her hands with it just then. Boone looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. In the lamplight, across the supper table, across 6 months of fence posts and irrigation channels, and legal documents and cold mornings, and the particular education of learning how to work beside someone without losing yourself in the process. Lucy, Evelyn said. Finish your drawing, and then it's time for bed. I know. Lucy was already adding detail to the third figure. She gave it large eyes, like everything she drew. The eyes looked straight out from the paper, steady and unafraid. I just wanted to get him in before I forgot what I was seeing. Grissom's appeal was heard on a Wednesday in late April before a circuit judge named Albright, who had come down from the Northern District and who had, according to Taggart, a reputation for impatience with cases he considered a waste of the court's time. Taggart argued the established use doctrine cleanly and without flourish. Caulfield argued the Coronado's deed primacy with the polished persistence of a man who believed that preparation could substitute for merit. Judge Albright asked 7 questions during the proceedings, 4 of them directed at Caulfield, and 3 of those 4 had the quality of questions asked by someone who has already identified the problem with an argument and wants to watch it be articulated. He ruled from the bench, which Taggart had told her beforehand was unusual and was generally a signal about the strength of a case. The appeal is denied, Albright said. The prior use documentation is substantial, and the original ruling stands. The water-sharing arrangement on the Mercer Creek boundary is recognized as an established right under frontier property law. He looked at Caulfield over his glasses. I'd suggest your client review whether further action serves any purpose beyond the consumption of court resources. Caulfield's face arranged itself into professional neutrality and stayed there. Evelyn sat in the courtroom bench and heard the ruling come down and felt something leave her body that had been living there since October, so not the fear exactly, because she'd learned to work alongside the fear, but the specific weight of not knowing, the suspension of waiting for a floor that might give way. It didn't give way. The floor held. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the first morning after the funeral when she'd gone out before light to do the barn chores because the chores didn't know anyone had died and the animals still needed feeding, and how she'd stood in the barn afterward and thought, I don't know how to do this. And then she'd done it anyway because there was no one else, and the doing was the only answer available. She'd been doing it ever since, imperfectly, stubbornly, at significant cost to her sleep and her patience and her knees. But she'd done it. Taggart was beside her. He put a hand briefly on her arm. Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer. Thank you, she said, for all of it. You did the hard part, he said. I just organized what was already true. She thought about that on the ride home. What was already true. The fence posts, the irrigation, the barn roof, the planted field, the partnership agreement in the deed box. Lucy at the table with her charcoal, drawing what she saw clearly. What was already true had been there the whole time. Taggart was right that it just needed organizing, but someone had to be willing to stand in a courtroom and say it plainly and refuse to be moved from it, and that had been her, and she was going to allow herself to know that without apology. She told Boone the ruling on the road home. He'd been at the homestead. She'd asked him to stay and watch Lucy and keep the morning irrigation running while she was in town, and he'd done it without making anything of the asking or the doing. He was at the fence line when she rode in, doing something to the east gate that required crouching down in a wrench, and the particular focused expression he brought to mechanical problems. He heard her horse and stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She looked at him from the horse, and he looked at her, and she saw him read her face and see what was there. Albright denied it, she said. He set the wrench down on the fence post. He straightened up fully. Ruled from the bench, she said. Taggart says Grissom could go to a higher circuit, but the cost and the slim chance make it unlikely. Boone nodded. He picked the wrench back up, looked at it for a moment, set it back down. Evelyn, he said. Don't make a speech, she said. I wasn't going to. Good. She dismounted. She tied the horse. She looked at the east field, at the corn coming up in rows that weren't perfectly straight because the ground had been uneven in places and you worked with what you had, but coming up, green and real and producing, doing the thing it was supposed to do. The gate? She said. Bottom hinge was working loose. Is it fixed? It is now. She looked at the hinge. It was solid. Of course it was solid. That was how he worked. She walked through the gate and into the east field and stood between the rows and looked at what they'd made. He came and stood beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous about it, close enough that she was aware of him, which she was aware of in a way that had stopped surprising her around February. "My brother wrote to me," he said. She looked at him. "Last week. I haven't answered." He looked at the corn rows. "He's in New Mexico, says he's doing better, says he's sorry." "Do you believe him?" He was quiet for a moment. "I believe he means it right now. Whether meaning it right now is enough, I don't know yet." "You don't have to decide today." "No." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about it because I've been thinking about what it costs to hold something closed, to decide someone isn't worth the risk of being wrong about." He paused. "I'm not making an argument for anything. I'm just thinking out loud." She looked at the field. "Write back to him," she said. "Not because he deserves it, because you do." He was quiet for a long moment. "When did you get so clear about things?" he said. Not skeptically. With something that might have been wonder, the kind that had been through enough to not be naive. "I've been clear about things my whole life," she said. "I just stopped hiding it in October." She felt him look at her. "When you stopped to help with the wagon," she said, "I was afraid you'd refuse." "I almost did." "I know." He said it with the recognition of someone who had watched her operate for 6 months and understood what almost meant for her. "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I." She looked at the corn growing in its imperfect rows. "Silas?" "Stay for supper." "I was planning to." "Stay after supper." He was quiet beside her. She felt the specific quality of his stillness come, not uncertainty, but care. The carefulness that Lucy had identified in October, that wasn't weakness. That was a man who understood the weight of things and handled them accordingly. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't make it into more than I said," she said. "We'll sit on the porch. It's going to be a warm evening, and I haven't sat on the porch after dark in 2 years, and I'd like company." "All right," he said. "That's all I'm saying." "I understand." She looked at him. He was looking at her, and his eyes were not sad in the way Lucy had described them in October. They were the eyes of someone who had arrived somewhere and knew it. "The gate's solid?" she said. "Very solid." "Come on then," she said. "Lucy's been inside all morning, and she'll have opinions about where to plant the second corn row." "She's usually right." "Don't tell her that. She already knows." They walked back through the gate and toward the house, and the April sun was warm on the field behind them, and the corn was growing, and the fence was solid, and the water ran clear and legal and unchallenged in the creek at the eastern edge of everything she'd built and fought for and refused to give up. The Consolidated Western Land Syndicate sent one final letter in May. It was brief, 3 sentences. The syndicate was withdrawing its interest in the Mercer property. They wished her continued success with the homestead. There was no mention of Grissom. She read it at the kitchen table and put it in the deed box, and that was the end of that. Grissom did not pursue the higher circuit appeal. Taggart wrote in June to confirm that the filing window had passed without action, which meant the water rights ruling was now permanent record. He sent his final invoice, which they paid from the spring yield with enough left over to cover the summer operating costs, and put a small amount into the tin that was not the deed box. Not a large amount. Not the kind of amount that changed the arithmetic dramatically, but enough that the arithmetic had a different character than it had in October. Not desperate, just tight, which was a different thing entirely. The East Field produced well. Not spectacularly. There was a dry spell in June that cost them the outer 2 rows on the south end, and one of the irrigation valves needed replacing mid-season, which was a cost they hadn't planned for, but well enough that when Boone sat down with the partnership accounting in late summer, the numbers were what they'd hoped for, close enough to the projections that the gap felt manageable rather than defeating. He laid it out at the kitchen table with the same precision he brought to everything. Each line item accounted for, nothing hidden or softened. She went through it the same way, and they agreed on the split, and she paid him his share in cash from the tin, and he put it in his jacket pocket without counting it, because he didn't need to. "That's the first season," she said. "It is. The second one should do better, If we extend the east field and get the north pasture fenced properly before fall. He nodded. I've been looking at the north pasture. There's a drainage issue on the low end that we need to address before we can run cattle on it. How long? 2 weeks of work, maybe 3. Then we start in September when the heat breaks. September, he agreed. She closed the account book. She looked at it sitting on the table between them, full of numbers that were honest and that she could stand behind. The partnership agreement, she said. He waited. The first season's done. The agreement technically allows either of us to give 30 days' notice and end the arrangement. She kept her voice neutral, matter of fact. I want to talk about whether we want to renegotiate the terms for next year. What terms do you want to change? She looked at him. The percentage split? I want to move toward equal. He held her gaze. That's more than I've earned. It's what a full partner earns, she said. I've watched you work for 9 months. I know what you put in. The 60-40 was the right structure for the beginning, when we didn't know each other and the risk was less quantifiable. She paused. The risk is quantifiable now, and so is what you bring. He was quiet. She could see him wanting to argue on the grounds of fairness from his side, the same instinct that had made him show up with shingles and call it surplus rather than charity, the difficulty he had accepting things at their full value. Silas, she said. He looked at her. You left your horse at the road the first time you came here because you didn't want to assume you were welcome. You've been not assuming you're welcome for 9 months. She held his gaze. You can stop. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the late summer evening was warm and golden, and the east fields stood full and harvested and already resting toward next year. And the fence lines ran straight to the horizon, and the barn was tight and had been tight all year, and the creek ran clear and legal along the eastern boundary. Equal terms, he said. Equal terms. He looked at the account book. He looked at her. I'll need somewhere to stay, he said. If I'm a full partner and I'm going to be here through the next planting season, driving to a rented room in Caldwell Flats every evening stops making sense. The back room, she said. Thomas used it as a workshop. It needs clearing out, but the stove works. He nodded slowly, working through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, seriously, not rushing to the easy answer. Lucy knows what she's asking, he said. About whether I'm staying. She's known for a while. She's 7, Evelyn said. She's been knowing things for a while. What do you want? He said. Not the arrangement, not the agreement. Her. She looked at him. 41 years old, with mud on her boots and a deed box full of hard-won papers, and a daughter who drew everyone with large eyes that expected to be seen clearly. She had been surviving for a year and a half, and then surviving had become the floor, and she was standing on the floor now, looking at what might be built above it. I want the north pasture drained and fenced before the first frost, she said. I want the corn rotation planned for next year before October. I want equal terms in writing by the end of the week. She paused. And I want to sit on the porch in the evenings with someone who doesn't require me to be something I'm not. He was looking at her with that directness that had not changed in 9 months, that had been there from the road in October, level and honest and without the particular vanity of a man who needed to be seen as more than he was. I can do all of that, he said. I know you can, she said. That's why I'm asking. Psst. Lucy took the news of Silas moving into the back room with the satisfaction of a person whose predictions have been confirmed by events. I knew it, she said at supper the night they told her. You knew what, specifically, Evelyn said. That the field needed 3 people. She ate her beans with complete composure. I drew it in February. The picture's on the wall in my room. It was. Evelyn had seen it every morning when she passed Lucy's doorway. 3 figures at the fence line with enormous eyes looking straight out, steady and unafraid, the field behind them going all the way to the horizon. Mr. Boone, Lucy said. Silas, he said. He'd been saying it for 2 weeks, gently, consistently. Lucy was working up to it. Silas, she said, trying it. She considered the sound of it. Silas? Okay. She picked up her fork. Are you going to teach me how to do the drainage thing in the north pasture? if you want to learn. I do. Mama says understanding water is the most important thing on a homestead. Your mama's right. She usually is. Lucy said it without irony, with the plain admiration of a child who has been watching a person do hard things well for long enough to recognize competence when she sees it. She pointed her fork at Evelyn. You should know that, for when you disagree about things. Evelyn looked at her daughter. Boone looked at Evelyn, and something passed between them. Not a joke exactly, but the specific warmth of two people who have been through enough together that they can share the humor in a child being right about them. I'll keep it in mind, Boone said. Good, Lucy said. She went back to her supper, satisfied. Teak. By the time the second autumn arrived, the Mercer homestead was a different place than it had been a year before, and it was the same place too, which was the right kind of change. The north pasture drainage was done. 3 weeks of hard work in September, unglamorous and necessary, and when the October rains came, the low end held and the water moved where they directed it instead of pooling and ruining the grass. They ran 8 head of cattle on it through early winter. Not a large herd. Enough. The back room had a bed and a stove, and Boone's few possessions arranged with the economy of a man who had been living out of saddlebags long enough to know what he actually needed and what he'd been carrying out of habit. He didn't bring much. He didn't need to. The place itself was providing the structure that he'd been missing, the specific weight of being somewhere that was his to tend and meant something to stay for. He and Evelyn were not simple with each other. They had never been simple with each other, and they didn't become so. They disagreed about things, sometimes sharply, and they'd learned that the disagreement was survivable, and that surviving it usually produced something better than either of them had arrived at alone. She was still herself, harder than was always comfortable, clearer than was always convenient, not inclined toward demonstrations of feeling that she hadn't fully worked through. He was still careful, still inclined to understate rather than overclaim, still the kind of man who showed up at the difficult moments not with speeches, but with the right tool and the willingness to use it. They suited each other. Not in the storybook way, in the real way, the way where each person's particular stubborn edges happened to fit the other's particular stubborn gaps. Not because they were designed for each other, but because they'd both done enough hard living to know what mattered and stop pretending about the rest. One evening in October, exactly a year from the morning on the road, though neither of them marked it formally, they were sitting on the porch in the early dark, which had become the shape of their evenings, and the air had that first real cold in it, and the fence lines were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there and she knew they were solid. A year, she said. He looked at her. October, she said. The road. He was quiet for a moment. You were covered in mud. You didn't look at me like that was remarkable. It wasn't. He looked out at the dark field. You were trying to fix your own problem. That seemed right. Most men would have made more of it. I know. He said it without pride, just acknowledgement. I've known men like that. I decided a long time ago I didn't want to be one. She looked at the dark. The coyotes were calling from the ridge, the same call she'd heard alone for a year and now heard differently. Not the sound of isolation, but just the sound the night made, the land being itself. Thomas would have liked you, she said. It was the first time she'd said it. She'd thought it before, many times, with the complicated mix of feelings that thought carried, the gladness and the grief together, the way they didn't cancel each other out, but had learned to occupy the same space. Boone was quiet for a moment. What was he like? Stubborn, she said. Funny, when he wanted to be. Terrible at asking for help. A pause. Better than me at letting people in. You let me in. Eventually. You let me in, he said again firmly, as though the eventually was not the relevant part. She looked at him. In the dark, she could see the outline of him, the familiar shape that she had become accustomed to in the way you became accustomed to things that mattered. Not invisibly, not without noticing, but with the particular gratitude of someone who understands what its absence would feel like. Silas, she said. I'm glad you stopped on the road. He looked at her. So am I, he said. Every day. She nodded. She looked back at the dark field. They sat there together on the porch of the house that held its heat, above the field that would be planted again in spring, beside the fence that stood solid, above the creek that ran clear and legally and permanently along the eastern edge of everything they'd built together and refused, together, to give away. The land didn't care who you were when you arrived on it. It didn't care about your grief or your pride or your stubborn insistence on doing everything alone. It didn't reward performance or punish honesty. It just was what it was. And it asked the same of you in return. And the people who lasted on it were not the ones who were strongest, or the ones who were luckiest, but the ones who were willing to keep showing up, to the work, to each other, to the daily, unglamorous truth of what it meant to build something worth keeping. Evelyn Mercer had known that since the beginning. She'd just had to remember once, in October, in the mud, with a child watching from the wagon seat and a quiet man with a come-along and a gray horse, that knowing it alone and knowing it together were not the same thing. They were not the same thing at all.